George from TheTinMen. How are you, mate?
Lovely to be here.
I have to say, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff that relates to men's health, men's mental health. I guess you are a voice for men
Mhm.
at a time in which the voices of men are either ridiculed, maybe sometimes not listened to, other times called privileged. But before we talk about any of that, I have to ask you, and I feel like I am going to be missing some kind of very obvious answer here, but why the Tin Men? Why did you call the page of the Tin Men?
Well, I didn't want to use my full name at the beginning, so practically it was more of a pseudonym for my own privacy. But the story of the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz, as I'm sure you know, is about a man that joined the journey to look for his own heart. So a Tin Man without a heart going on a journey to find it. But then at the end of the story, spoiler alert, he always had a heart. And I feel like the Tin Man is such a good character to represent men in general, where we're told that we don't have a heart, we don't know how to feel, we don't have emotions, but we do if you look hard enough. So I suppose the Tin Men is a journey for all men to realise that they are human beings, they have got a heart, and they are deserving of love, and they're not part of some oppressive, tyrannical gender class of men. And yeah, so it felt like a good fit. I wanted the Tin Man, but couldn't get it. I had one person come to me say, one person was like, "I don't understand your name. There is no T in men. There's no T in men." And I was like, there's not the T in men. It's the Tin Men. So yeah,
Well, you're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. So,
yeah,
I
yeah.
like it. I like the analogy. I thought it must have been something linked to the Wizard of Oz, but you don't want to assume. I wouldn't want to
I,
misrepresent your Instagram handle.
I had someone have a go at me the other day on X, being like, calling me an idiot, and he was like, "That's no surprise. The Tin Man hasn't got a brain." And I was like, "No, the Scarecrow doesn't have a brain. The Tin Man doesn't have a heart. You idiot." I was like, "Way to fuck up that fucking insult." But the Scarecrow doesn't have a brain. The Tin Man doesn't have a heart. The Lion doesn't have a voice, I think. But they all find it or realise they always had one, and that's the story of Wizard of Oz.
There you go, mate. I've never looked at it that deep. I think the last time I watched The Wizard of Oz, I was probably 6 or 7, so I might have to readdress it.
And it's
Some kind
nice
of
because
like
there's a witch as well. There's a witch at the end, the Wicked Witch of the West, is it? And it's like we're on the journey to get the witch, who I suppose is like the classic feminist overlord that people seem to think that I'm off to get. And it's like, wow, such a nice. There's a lot of parallels that make a lot of sense. But yeah, the Tin Men.
George, I feel like you alluded to in our pre-conversation that it is not always easy to do what you do, just because of I guess, the backlash that comes with it. When you talk about a topic that is relatively unpopular in modern society, which is crazy to say because the topic is men, it feels like the cost that comes with addressing those conversations is almost this suggestion that it's zero sum, that to
Mm.
address men's issues has to come at the cost of women's issues. And I know that that is not your message at all, but I wonder whether you actually feel that in real life or whether you just feel that in online life. Because to me, I've never, like, as a nearly 30-year-old man, I have to say that I have a relatively privileged life.
Mm.
I'm blessed with love, good health, great opportunities from a work standpoint. I live in a great area here in Australia. And when I walk down the street, no matter who I interact with, on 99.5% of occasions, I feel like the world is a pretty good place.
Mm.
But it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like that online when we're addressing these topics or conversations.
No, well, if you look at your phone or your laptop and then you look outside the window or take a walk down the road, they are very different experiences. Easy to become too immersed within the online world to forget that, especially where we live. I mean, I'm in the UK. I live as much of a privileged life as you. That we have it very good. Not only to be born in some of the best countries, safest countries in the world, the freest countries in the world, but also the freest, safest time in human history. Like, we could have been born 100,000 years ago, which would have been shit. We could have been born 100 years ago. It's a miracle. We've won the lottery. And then we've won the lottery again to be born in one of the 7 or 8 billion people that is in the UK or Australia. Like, so always starting with a position of gratitude. And then in that country, of the middle class. Like, I'm extraordinarily privileged. I'm always happy to state that. And that's one of the reasons why I don't like to use my name either, because this isn't about me. I don't want a lot of people's social media accounts are just literally photos of themselves, their story, their opinions, their ideas, and it's often a lot of it's woe is me, things are so hard. That's not true for me. I have a really good life. I really appreciate what I've got. I'm very grateful. What I'm doing is what I've been told to do, where I've used my privilege to help those who are not privileged, sending the elevator down, for lack of a better term, and trying to help some of the guys up who don't have anyone speaking for them or don't have anyone speaking from a position of kindness. And that's what I want to do. This isn't about me. I don't want people to start getting their violin out for me or thinking I'm some sort of martyr, because I'm not. I live a very lovely life. Not always easy, but it's great. I love my account. I mean, sometimes it's difficult. We can talk about the things that are difficult, but the good overwhelmingly overpowers the bad. And although I get some silly things said to me or about me or sent to me, I also get far, far more kind things said about me all the time, every day. And there are loads of people in this space that are doing really good work that don't get those messages either. So I feel bad for them. And I live a privileged life, of course.
So let me ask you the $1,000,000 question. At what point in recent history do you feel like the quality of men's lives and the statistics that represent men's mental health, men's health, physical health, but also men's realities in the modern world, at what point do you feel like those statistics started to represent a regression in the quality of their lives?
I think the men have been impacted by the things that have always existed, but we don't ever seem to see them. We only ever see men through like a telescope, where our view of men is defined by the men at the very top, the men who are the political leaders, the CEOs, the billionaires that are all highly privileged, hyper successful, but represent a tiny percentage of all men. Working men, for example, have always been oppressed in many ways throughout all of history. They've gone through some of the hardest times imaginable. They've always been there, but we don't see them because we don't separate those men out from the men who are walking down Wall Street with their stocks and shares, counting their money, CEOs of their own company. We have quite a cartoonish view of men. So I'd argue that the men I talk about have always existed, but they've just been hidden by a very low resolution caricature of men, talking about things like the patriarchy and male privilege and other quite regressive views of the world. And those are the men I want to highlight, so put spotlight on them, and also men who aren't in our countries, around the world. And I think if you think about things like suicide, which is like a bit like a common denominator for so many issues I talk about, everything I talk about impacts suicide. So suicide's an interesting barometer to use for how well are men doing in the world. For as long as we've had statistics on suicide, which is hundreds of years now, they've been higher than women's, like significantly higher than women's. The male suicide issue isn't a modern phenomenon. It's always been this way. And they're higher in every country and have been every year since we've been collecting data. So it's not that they didn't exist until recently. They've always existed. We didn't care to talk about them. We didn't give a shit. And even before the stats were collected, I imagine they were higher for all of history, I imagine. So I don't agree that there's been any point in history where men have suddenly ended up in the position they are now. I think they've always been that way, but we haven't looked at them through a lens that reveals them in the way that I'm trying to.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point you make, and I guess maybe my own reflection there is that it feels like things are getting worse, and so maybe it feels like there has been at some point a swing of the pendulum in the wrong direction.
No, in many ways it's a good thing that things have gotten worse, because I don't think they have gotten worse. It reminds me of like cancer rates. When I was younger, 1 in 3 people got cancer. Now it's 1 in 2. That doesn't mean more people are getting cancer. It just means that we're seeing it better, we're seeing it earlier. We've improved the resolution of the way in which we can find cancer. So it's not that more people are getting it, it's that we're revealing the people that need our help more. So I guess my content represents a lens I'm putting in front of society where we're revealing more men suffering. But that doesn't mean that's just because that hasn't happened. It's always happened, but now we can see it a little bit better. So in that weird way, it is a good thing that we are now seeing these men, because they always existed. We just ignored them until now. And we still ignore them, of course. We need a lot more people doing this work, but it's certainly better than it was.
So why do you think that the internet, and in particular the people who exist on the polar extremes of, fighting the feminist cause or fighting the men's cause, seem to have a problem with each other's issues being addressed. Because it feels like to me, one thing that I've found to be a common occurrence is that when you see a leading feminist figure discuss an issue that they feel is pertinent for women right now, and there is usually a level of outrage and aggression in the videos from these figures that seems to strike a chord and at least create some kind of reaction from men who disagree with that issue. And I can understand the passion on both sides, but I think ultimately, if the goal is to progress the feminist cause or men's cause, I think that we have to be sensitive to how the message is delivered. Otherwise, we ultimately just infuriate each side and cause a greater rift.
Yeah. I mean, I try not to go toe-to-toe with feminist individuals anymore because everyone ends up getting covered in shit. No one comes out better, and a lot of these feminist voices, they thrive on a sense of victimhood. That's where they get their power, a sense of being the victim. So if you call them out or rebuke what they're saying, you're actually playing into their power dynamic where they get to be like, oh my God, look at this white man's coming after me. So I just ignore them. They're not worth my time anymore. There are certain individuals where, not on social media, but politically, I will point them out. So there's been a lot done recently in the UK where they're going to start revoking the legal right to shared parental responsibility, which is going to could impact millions of fathers in a really negative way and deprive a lot of men and dads of their children and children of their fathers, more importantly. That's a problem. So although I won't, if there's someone whining in my comments or making silly videos about me on Instagram, I'm confident I'm just going to ignore them because they're not worth my time. But then when there are people that are meddling in politics, doing things that have a tangible negative impact on men's lives, then you'll see me there, sword and shield on the vanguard, trying my best. And I think I know there's people that are more reasonable in this space than I am. They see me as a bit of see how well I do, and they see how people respond, and then I'm a bit of like a canary in the mine to how they all then step in. So it's all part of the system, really. But I mean, there's people that go through my podcasts to a clipboard right now, probably ticking things off. Oh, that's not quite right. That's not this and that, and they interpret what I'm doing in such a poor way, so uncharitable, and then they'll probably make some stupid video. They'll probably make a video about this one, and that's fine. Fill your boots, but I'm not going to respond. I've not got time for that. There's better things to do. So, yeah, I mean, I try not to get into feuds anymore because you always end up worse off. I do, at least. No matter how hard I try, I always end up getting covered in shit. So, yeah.
Well, I feel like the unfortunate thing is that the net benefit of those feuds is actually at a negative. Right? Because it kind of just pushes people further away from each other. Whereas I feel like if you go through your Instagram page and what you see is a bunch of carousels that are grounded in genuine research from... I know you mentioned the CDC. What is the CDC?
Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So federal tax-funded health organization in America where they have all the best data on anything pertaining to health, and not just like physical health, but societal impacts on health. So a lot of the domestic and sexual violence data I take from the CDC, because it's not a private organization, it's not a political organization, it's a massive government-funded, huge organization that is non-partisan and has existed for decades. So really useful source of data for me, but ultimately they fund research and do lots of really interesting investigations into women's and men's health and collect a lot of data.
Yeah, so your Instagram page is full of genuine data that reflects these ideas and topics for the realest, most up-to-date research. And so it's hard to argue with that when you see it painted out like that. But I think it's easier to, and I wonder whether this has been a strategy of yours, it's easier to clap back at somebody's face speaking on a podcast clip or in this kind of format, because it feels like more of a personal attack as opposed to a representation of information.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I take that as a compliment. Where if you've got a problem with my voice or my accent or my hair or whatever else, if that's what you've chosen to insult about me, that just shows you've got nothing better to say about the content that I'm talking about. So I ignore those most of all. Those are just not. Those really are a waste of time. But yeah, I genuinely try to present the data in the most complete, fairest way possible. And if people don't like that, then there's not much I can do about it. Like, I will present the data from the CDC on domestic, intimate partner and sexual violence. And when it comes to intimate partner violence, it's shown to be impacting men and women at equal rates. In fact, I think every single CDC ever published has shown more men are impacted by intimate partner violence on a yearly basis, that is, only by a few percent. But I'm not interested in whether you like or dislike or find that offensive. That's the facts as presented by the CDC, and I'm just holding that up. I'm just holding up a mirror. Like, this is what the data says, the best data. No, it's not perfect, but whatever you see reflected back is not really my problem. Like, you've just got to deal with the facts. And like I said, you can take you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So I'm just taking the horse to water, and what you do with it is up to you. And yeah, there's loads. I mean, I often get data from similar. I mean, I use a lot of the Office for National Statistics, which is a bit like the UK equivalent of the CDC in many ways, and lots of NHS data and similar things in Australia. And yeah, I don't spend too much time worrying about if the data is offensive. I worry about, is it accurate? Is it complete? Is it fair? And if it is, then here, take a look. Here it is.
So you just mentioned intimate partner violence. Can we talk about that for a moment? And what actually qualifies as intimate partner violence? Is it just physical and sexual violence, or is there an emotional component to the way they break that down?
I mean, if we're talking about how the CDC qualifies intimate partner violence, they break it down into many ways, but the top line, they talk about physical violence. That's not to say emotional abuse cannot also be violence, but for the CDC data, they specifically talk about physical violence. They also talk about coercive control. They also talk about image-based abuse they've been talking about recently. Sexual violence they talk about. Image-based abuse? Well, it's like you're distributing, sharing images of someone else without their consent of a sexual nature in a way that is abusive. And the most recent data that's come out has found that I think about 40% of people impacted by that are male. So it's 60% female, and women are more likely to share a sexually explicit image of someone without their consent than a man. I think it's only slightly more. I think it's about 53 versus 47%, but more. I mean, that's surprising. I also want to write, I mentioned how every CDC study, which is the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey ever published, has shown more males victimized on a 12-month basis by intimate partner violence. There's a new one coming out. Could be out any day now. I'm literally refreshing my page every single day for it to come out. So I don't know if that might say something differently. So by the time this podcast comes out, if the 23-24 survey comes out and it's different, I just want to say I haven't seen that data yet because it's literally not out, but it will be out probably in the next few days.
It's interesting you say that, right? Because I just thought about, if the percentages shift, that of course there'll be people who want to critique your analysis today. But I think what the important point is, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, George, is that statistic, whether slightly below that of women or slightly above, is quite shocking to hear, because the conversation around men being victims of domestic or intimate partner violence is kind of a conversation that isn't being had. Now, I wonder that, there's two frames of mind in which I think of this from. The first being that I think there is probably a level of shame from men to come out and have those conversations. It feels maybe more taboo than it is for, I know it's still incredibly challenging for women who have been through those circumstances, and I've had conversations with some of those women through this podcast and out in the world, in real life. And there is certainly shame that comes from both ends. But there is this stereotype or misconception that because you're a man and you should be more physically dominant, that you shouldn't be susceptible to intimate partner violence in a male-female relationship. Is that a fair statement, you think?
You mean a lot of statements made, some of them fair, some of them not fair. What is definitely fair is that there are many women and men on both sides that are being abused that will never talk or share it, or certainly not report it to the police. Off the top of my head, I think it's about 19% of women that are being abused won't tell anyone, and about 50% of men being abused won't tell anyone. So about 2 to 3 times more men won't tell anyone of their abuse. But that doesn't mean women are all speak. There's definitely a problem on both sides of the divide. but it does seem to be disproportionately impacting men. And a lot of our data is based on police reports. So you'll see different data to what I've presented to you, where 80% of police reports for domestic abuse are against men, but that's because more women report. That doesn't mean, it's a bit like what we're talking about in terms of that the lens we're putting in front of the data, where if we're looking at domestic violence through police data, and especially prosecutions data, which is more like 90% against men, we're not seeing the unreported violence of those men who either don't acknowledge the abuse themselves, don't identify it, they just think that's part of, this is a normal behaviour when it isn't. And then even if they do see that, they're not reporting it to the police. And in both cases, they're not being recorded. And then there's also a layer on top of that where a man will notice the abuse, will call the police, and then the police won't file that down as what it is. And most interestingly, it's more often male police officers that are failing to correctly report abuse against a man as abuse. So there's lots of ways in which men fall through the gaps, and women, but in those ways it's more men it happens to. So that's totally valid. But the second thing you said about men are bigger, therefore they should be able to defend themselves from abuse or something along those lines is obviously a common trope that's trotted out essentially to diminish male victimization, which is entirely naive and ignorant to how abuse develops. In that person's mind, they seem to think that both partners arrive at an abusive relationship in some sort of like street fighter arrangement where you have a big strong man and then they're fighting in some sort of physical fight. And that's not how it happens. People don't suddenly just start fighting. What happens in a lot of abusive relationships is it's precluded by years often of coercive control, emotional abuse, in many different ways, so many ways you wouldn't even begin to understand. There's so many ways in which you can have the upper hand. And although a man, generally speaking, has got a massive physical advantage over a woman, that doesn't mean he's now immune to abuse, because women can exercise control or dominance in different ways. So women can destroy your life without even having met you. I know someone right now whose life is being destroyed by another woman, and she's a woman, and she's never even met her. Not only has she never had a physical altercation, but she's never even met, and her life has been totally ruined, destroyed, and she's not lifted a finger. So it's not, this idea that abuse is entirely physical is misleading to all the ways in which someone can destroy your life and cause you to even take your own life without any sort of physical contact. But when we talk about physical violence, people will talk about 3 and 4 intimate partner or domestic homicides against a woman, which is true. But that, again, we're just looking at a small percentage of all abuse. That's like a tiny percentage of 1%, which is important, but it's certainly far from the complete picture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I should clarify too. When I said, is it a fair statement before, I meant, is it a fair statement that men probably don't report it as highly because of the stereotype they feel they have to fit, and the shame that comes with that.
I think the stereotype is part of the problem, but also we don't, like you said earlier, we don't see the conversation about male victims. We don't see politicians talking about it. We don't really see it in the media or on TV shows. We rarely see like advertisements for male services of abuse, mainly because they don't exist. I don't think there's a single shelter for male victims in all of Australia. I don't think there's a single one. And the billions of Australian dollars the government have announced to invest into domestic violence, none of that seems to be going to male victims. Even massive men's health NGOs such as Movember, which come from Australia, they don't talk about male victims of abuse. So considering there's so little conversation about men, it's not surprising that men don't see it themselves. So why would a man see themselves as a victim of abuse when no one else does? So it is partly the shame, but also we don't show men, we don't talk about it ourselves as society as a whole, both male and female. So Gloria Steinem, who is obviously iconic feminist voice, she said, to be it, you have to see it. And she was talking about female CEOs, which is a good point. We do need to see women leading businesses and nations, so to encourage other women to see themselves in that way. But that also applies to male victims of abuse. And when a man who's being abused doesn't see himself spoken about or represented anywhere, now go ahead now and Google domestic violence and see how many times that man will be recognised. And so, you have to see it. And it's down to us as a society to show men that you are a legitimate victim, you are deserving of help, as much as any female victim. So it's not just a shame, it's the fact that we've betrayed men. We don't represent them. Or boys, of course. Yeah,
it's a really good point you make, George. It just made me think when we were speaking about I guess maybe some of the stigmas that come with men's abuse. There was, I think it was last year or 2024 in Australia. In fact, in my local area here in the Illawarra, which is just south of Sydney, there was a horrible incident of a female teacher at a high school having sex with a young male student who, was convicted, is now behind bars. But you start to read the threads of these comments in the news articles that pop up on social media, and you see comments, a lot of them being from young men, about, I wish my teachers were like this when I was at school, or, lucky boys, or these kind of comments that actually minimize the issue at hand, which is sexual abuse of an infant child who is, I think in this case, they were 13 or 14 years of age. And you're like, how is there a conversation that's moving in this direction when it comes to male victims? But it seems like for the most case, us men are kind of the worst ones at pushing that conversation in that area. Are you seeing any statistics around this and having conversations about this on your podcast and in your world?
I've seen those comments too, and I agree. It is mostly men. Those comments are gross, really gross, and they are mostly men saying it. But I mean, I guess that makes sense because it's mostly men who are attracted to women. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily just because they're men. It's that they're the ones that are most often attracted to women. But yeah, I mean, hands up. I mean, that's a mostly male problem. I've seen those comments too. It's absolutely horrible and really damaging and stupid. It reminds me of an article that came out yesterday. So this is the 28th of January. Here's an article written by the Daily Mail. Glamorous blonde music teacher's breathtaking confession in court as she admits having sex with a boy, 12. So we have a paedophile who has raped a boy who's 12 years old in a position of power as a teacher, and she's described as a glamorous blonde having sex with a boy. I'm like, it's not sex, it's rape, and she's not glamorous, she's a paedophile, and she's a rapist. And then, that's the Daily Mail, that's like a national newspaper. I mean, there's no denying there's a problem with men saying those things, but when they're reading headlines like that, they're being told, oh, okay, yes, all right, maybe this is something worthwhile. And that was yesterday. That's happening now. So it's not a thing in the past, it's still going. But what you're talking about is the lucky boy phenomenon. And it's not just people in the comments. Here's another one. I had a threesome with two 15-year-old boys. You can't have threesomes with 15-year-olds if you're an adult. You can rape them, though. Here's some from actual judges. This is Judge Tim Mousley from 2015. This is a direct quote. A judge on an actual sexual violence case against a child. Having read everything before me, it was quite clear he was a mature 11-year-old and you were an immature 20-year-old. So that narrows the arithmetic age gap between you. QC, 2015. Here's another one.
That's madness.
Yeah, 2020, Sarah Mallet, another judge. This was a relationship of mutual affection and no pressure applied or grooming of any sort. That was against a boy who was 14 by a woman who's 22, a judge. Here's another one, 2017, Judge Sheila Canavan. I accept he was consenting. What 15-year-old schoolboy would turn down such an attractive offer? So, forget about the comments, although they are important. These are judges presiding on the cases themselves. And then we will see instances of like women who are doing, rapists who are doing these things, and they'll get like a suspended sentence. You would never get, here's some actual sentences.
That's madness.
This is a woman that raped a 13-year-old boy, spared jail. Another one, 13-year-old boy, 60 days in jail. Raped a 15-year-old boy, spared jail, spared jail, spared jail, spared jail. And then obviously the media are talking about, oh yeah, well, what's the one I read to you? Ridiculous. Glamorous teacher has sex with boy 12 or has a threesome. It's like these are rapists and these are paedophiles. They're not saucy cougars. They are predators. And we need to start talking about them because to be it, you have to see it. So that's why a lot of people in the comments are like, oh, I want a saucy cougar. I want a glamorous, blonde bombshell. So yeah, sorry for saying paedophile and rapist so much. You might have to blur those out in your podcast, but
No,
those are the
okay.
correct words. Those are the correct words to use to describe these predators, and we don't say that. Someone in a response to that Daily Mail article, someone posted a photo of Jeffrey Epstein being like, "Silver fox takes girl to his," and it's like making a point like you wouldn't say that about Jeffrey Epstein. You wouldn't call him like handsome older man. You'd be like rapist, paedophile, which he is and was. You wouldn't say that about him. We certainly wouldn't say it on a national newspaper. So yeah, it's just a complete fucked up thing. It's like this whole lucky boy phenomenon where we seem to think a boy should be grateful for being sexually abused is so gross. And then you look at the stats. There's a 2018 study what found of 1,200 adults in America, 1 in 4 believed a man enjoys being raped by a woman. So yeah, it's shocking.
Yeah, it's madness. There's certainly a mismatch in the way that these are represented. And it's funny, now that you mentioned that story from yesterday, I did see that article pop up about the music teacher. And in fact, the article mentioned that she taught 6 to 12-year-old kids, which is even more troublesome because you hear about the 12-year-old kid story, but you don't know what else has happened in that environment. And you don't know the risk that those other kids were at during those lessons, which minimizes how serious of a matter this is. I can imagine that every one of the parents of those students would be absolutely mortified that their kids were in an environment with a predator like that. And the fact that, well, it doesn't surprise me that it was the Daily Mail because they sound about as reputable in the UK as they are in Australia.
That's a rag.
Yeah.
Awful.
But it's just awful that we have gotten to a point in this conversation where there is almost an utter disregard for the sexual abuse of young men, in this case, children.
Yeah, and I mean, if anything good can come out of that story, it's if you look at the responses to that tweet by the Daily Mail, every single one was about, what are you talking about? This is so inappropriate. Like, those are the wrong, and people like taking the words like glamorous blonde and being like rapist, and taking the words had sex with 12-year-old boy and putting raped a 12-year-old boy and calling her this. She's not glamorous, she's a paedophile. And like people, every single response to that tweet that I care to look at was saying the same thing. Like, that is disgusting, it's gross, that is sickening, do better. And good. I think that people's attitudes are changing, but somehow the newspapers that should be leading the vanguard of changing people's minds, they're stuck in this one-dimensional regressive view where boys should be grateful for being raped by women. So yeah, it's changing.
I wonder, George, whether you have any research on the correlation between young men that are sexually abused and how it affects their mental health and suicide rates later on in life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about boys. Young men, people say young men as a bit like, I'm not saying you're doing that, but people say that as a way to diminish who they are and their children. So they're the boys that are being raped. And yeah, I mean, I remember reading a study that found a boy who's sexually abused in adolescence 10 times more likely to attempt suicide as an adult later in life. So that's obviously terrifying, and it's even more shocking where a lot of so-called male suicide prevention, men's health charities who are saying we want to help men, we want to stop men ending their lives, they won't talk about boys who are sexually abused. They'll stay away from the conversation because it's deeply unpopular, and it is somehow. But if you're not going to talk about boys who are being sexually abused, who then go on to have a 10 times higher rate of ending their own life, are you really talking about suicide? I don't think you are, certainly not in a complete way. Same applies to domestic violence. I think it's about between 9 and 11% of men experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence will consider suicide. And when you consider how many millions of men are in that position, that doesn't surprise me. I think about 80% of suicides as a result of abuse are male. That's never really talked about. And yeah, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, relational violence, especially at a young age, has a massively detrimental, negative impact on a boy's mental health. And then, of course, growing up as an adult, if he's unable to verbalize it and get help to regulate that pain effectively, then you're leaving him so much more vulnerable to suicide. I mean, and also not only being victims of sexual violence, but also a lot of allegations are thrown around against boys unduly, and this is even more unpopular. We're talking about false allegations of sexual violence, where a lot of boys are accused of doing things they never did, and they often go on to end their lives. I remember I did a conference on male suicide about a year ago, about the different causes of male suicide, of which there are many, too many to talk about one podcast. And then I had a lovely woman tap me on the shoulder at the end called Paula, and she told me about her son who was falsely accused of raping a girl at university, and never went to the police because it never happened. but the university decided to act in some way, and they basically took him out of his student accommodation and put him in isolation on his own. Although his friends did a lot to stand by him, the rest of the university saw him as a rapist. And, well, he's been separated out. He must have done it. And he ended his own life. And I talked to her. I still talk to her. I talked to her yesterday. And she's doing a lot to try and set up a helpline for anyone that's been accused of a crime, to give them support. And there needs to be some reform where, until that person's been found guilty, we shouldn't be publishing their names. We shouldn't be putting their photos on newspaper headlines. We don't know if they're actually perpetrators or indeed victims, as he was. So that's probably the most controversial thing I talk about, false allegations, but someone's got to talk about it. And too often it's seen as a lightning strike event. Oh, you got more chance of being struck by lightning than you have being falsely accused. That's not true. That's not true at all. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
There was an awful story in the last 2 years here in Australia about a young boy who was in his teenage years who's, I believe he was coerced into sending a nude photo online, and this photo was distributed, and he was, I think within like the first 72 hours of this photo, going out online, he was, so upset and so taken back by it. He just didn't know how to have the conversation with his family and took his own life. And, his dad was later picking up the pieces and has essentially dedicated his life moving forward to, having these conversations in schools and spreading the message of how important it is to firstly try to stop these things from happening and actually police when these incidents occur, but also, encouraging young men to have conversations when they're victims of these scenarios. And mate, it's bloody awful. The one thing I want to ask you is, when we talk about these young boys that are abused, they're either raped, sexually abused, at whatever stage and age of their life, I wonder how it affects their sexual relationships and just their relationships with women in general moving forward, and whether we see a retreat for the most part from having any kind of intimate relationship with a woman because of the way that they've suffered abuse earlier in their life.
First of all, there's a large portion of boys who are sexually abused by men as well. So it's not like they don't exist. In many ways, a lot of cases of abuse, the majority are by men. It's not just women, but there is definitely a different type of stigma around female perpetration of abuse. But I'm sure, naturally, I think in a common sense way, it would definitely make you apprehensive to be around anyone who looks or seems similar to your abuser, and even things that are close to what they did be difficult. I know a friend of mine who's a hero of mine in many ways, called Duncan, who set up a charity called We Are Survivors for male victims of sexual violence, and he's trying to change the way in which we perform medical procedures on men, young men and boys, especially older men, for older men, like prostate exams, where we need to actually see a lot of these men as victims of sexual violence, and we need to be more cautious around how we perform these very intimate, vulnerable procedures on them, like we do with women. Like women who are having sexual examinations, there's a lot of safeguarding, quite rightly, around how do we do this in a way that is most mindful of their comfort and safety as much as possible. We don't do that for men. So he'll talk a lot about dentistry. But that's quite invasive procedure. I had an endoscopy a few months ago. That was an invasive procedure. A lot of examinations, sexual examinations, they're invasive. So we need to understand a lot of these men are victims of abuse, and how can we be more mindful of these procedures going forwards? In terms of how does it impact relations between men and women and men, both ways? Of course, it goes without saying, it's going to permanently alter your attitude around those people, including women. A lot of the women who don't like me often have their own traumatic experiences at the hands of men, and that is terrible. You didn't deserve that. I'm sorry it happened. I understand your dislike of men in many ways comes from a real place. So sadly, there are too many experiences between men and women at the hands of men and women that push us apart, and I understand where that comes from, and it's a natural thing in many ways, but we need to find ways to move past them, all of us, because most men and women aren't like that. Most men and women are excellent people and would never dream of doing such things. going back to what you said about that boy and the dad who's done such a tragic story that happens too much. That's called sextortion. Sextortion is a word we should all be adopting into our own lexicons and talking about as much as possible. But sextortion describes a new crime, image-based abuse, which we talked about. So this is one of those crimes where typically a boy, I think 90% of people impacted are boys, but it's not all boys, who are coerced into sending a sexually explicit, hang on one sec. Alexa, stop. Boys who are coerced into sending sexually explicit images to a stranger online. Often it happens really fast, and then as soon as that image has been obtained by their predator, they reveal that they're not actually this young woman or girl on Snapchat. They're actually not. Often it's a man doing it. A lot of it from Nigeria. Like a lot of it's like the Nigerian prince scam, and then they'll start blackmailing you, saying you need to send me this much money. Otherwise, I'm going to send this photo to everyone. I've got hold of your Facebook contacts and your family and friends. I'm going to send it to everyone unless you send me this much money. And your girlfriend, she's not going to appreciate you sending this photo. And it's leading to so many suicides in boys. Like, it's horrible, and it happens so fast. It can happen overnight. I've seen it happen where a boy sees his girlfriend, goes home in the evening, connects with this predator, maybe 10 o'clock at night. For the next few hours, the predator does the whole thing and basically exploits them. And then in the morning, they've killed themselves. So it can happen overnight, literally overnight. And it's not like other scams where a lot of older people are targeted with online scams, not in the same way, but someone might pose as their bank manager to exploit money from them. That might take weeks or months to get that level of trust. But for boys, it's so much faster and so much more dangerous and leads to loss of life. And a lot of that's because we don't teach boys not to send explicit images to anyone online under any circumstance, because you don't really know who it is, and it might be one of these people. So that's our failure. To be it, like you said, you have to see it, and boys are not talked about in this way. We don't tell boys not to do this thing, but the father of that boy, sounds like he is doing that. So what a wonderful bloke, and what tragic story that's led him to doing that. But sextortion is something we should all be talking about. Certainly should be talking about in terms of if you have a young boy, whatever, be like, don't send messages to anyone like this, and start educating them as we have been our girls, and keep educating the girls. But these are lessons a lot of them have learnt, but now it's time to tell our boys, because they are vulnerable, and it's costing lives. It's ending lives. It's horrible.
I wonder whether you've seen the news, George, just in Australia 48 hours ago, that where I live in New South Wales, a state that I reside in, the opposition government party has just elected a minister for men.
Yeah.
And yeah, I found this interesting. I thought, well, maybe this is starting to move in the right direction, because I know that we have a national minister for women. We don't have a national minister for men yet, but I wonder whether we're starting to see some progress on these issues. Or my other thought is whether this is the recognition of what happened in the US politically, where one party seemed to speak to young men who weren't being spoken to by the other party. And this is a potentially an opportunistic grab at a whole bunch of voters in their electorate.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's the former. I hope it is genuine policy coming from a real place rather than an opportunity grab. And even if it is the latter, if it ends in a minister of men being established, an individual to look in so many issues such as sextortion, plus many more things we can talk about, issues that disproportionately impact men and boys, then I don't really care so much about what motivates it, as long as the end point's the same. But yeah, what we learned a lot from America is that you may not like men and boys, you may not think they have issues that impact them, but unfortunately they also have a vote. They have the same vote as women. And if they don't see anything in your policy about them, then you can't be surprised that they don't vote for you. If you don't represent their issues or show them in your sort of marketing, or if you're Kamala Harris, openly mock them, you can't then be shocked when they decide to vote for the other person, no matter how ridiculous and stupid and offensive, misogynistic he is. And I hate him. Obviously I hate Donald Trump. He's just mad. But I can see why people would vote for him. I wouldn't have voted for him. I still would have voted for Kamala, but at least he didn't mock you. He didn't erase you, sneer. But what I know about, I've only seen a few things about what's happening in Australia. But that's great. I mean, a lot of these things come out of nowhere. A lot of these things, that's never going to happen. And then next week, there it is. It's like this good news can surprise you that way. And that is good news. It's exciting, despite what motivates it. And I hope we follow suit. I don't think any country has a minister for men. We have a minister for women, and a minister for women's health, and an ambassador for women's health. Different government positions that are quite rightly there to support women and their health needs, but none of those exist for men. Despite men's health being in the toilet really bad, worse than women's. So hopefully the Minister for Men will be a recognition in Australia, if it comes to be, of the very real systemic issues that impact men and boys that no one's talking about and is costing them their lives. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's the opposition, isn't it? I mean, it's just chat. It's not like it's actually happening. But if they make that a serious policy, they will be rewarded with votes from men and women who care about men, and rightly so. So it's good to remind politicians that even it's in their own interests to talk about these things, because like you said, 49% of the population are men, and they will more likely vote for you if you produce life-saving policy for them, like the Minister for Men, but many more. We've had violence against men and boys bill proposed last April. We've had the men's health strategy passed in November, announced in November, just gone. We've had discussion around Minister for Men, but only in the media, not serious policy. We've had changes to the Office for National Statistics to recognise male victims of sexual violence. Like, there's loads of things happening just in the past 12 months. So it's happening, and it's happening suddenly and unexpectedly. So it's good to be ahead of that curve and encouraging politicians to do more and more and more. And yeah, I caught me by surprise. I didn't expect it from Australia. Australia seems to be in many ways dragging its feet in this area, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I'm glad I could be the provider of some good news for you.
I saw it mentioned. I was like, that can't be true. What? But yeah.
Well,
good.
mate, to be honest, it surprised me too. And you know, I'm a big believer that, you know, I can hear your sentiment throughout this podcast as well, and I'm sure you see eye to eye with me on this, that whether it's physical health, mental health, sexual abuse, any of these given topics that are important to be addressed because they're, you know, massively affecting people's lives and the quality of their lives, should be there should be plenty of funding for both men and women in those spaces. I think that goes without saying. But I think that there is a valuable conversation to be had in that we maybe, not in every case, but for the most part, need to attack those issues slightly different for women and slightly differently for men. Especially with men's health. Like, men, it's so hard to get men to the doctors. You know, like in Australia, you hear so many stories of guys who just don't go to the doctors, don't get checked, don't check in on an issue that they're clearly having consistently over a period of time, and they have some kind of unfortunate health diagnosis, usually physically or in a lot of cases mentally too, with their mental health, where they have an unfortunate outcome. But I think it's because a lot of the health agendas don't seem to fit or aren't tailored towards the way that men would actually respond to that call to go and see the doctor or to think more deeply about their mental health. You know, I know that the conversation is certainly not new, that therapy doesn't always feel like the most natural response to a mental health crisis for a man. I have a podcast in which I sit down and look into people's eyes every week. I'm sure that if I needed it, therapy would feel relatively comfortable for me because I'm so used to this format of conversation. But I know for a lot of guys, they don't want to sit and stare into another person's eyes and talk about their problems. And so I think that ultimately the benefit of having a minister for men and a minister for women for each country would be really at a net positive.
Yeah.
So it's a wonder it's taken us this long.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the annoying thing for me as a guest on podcasts is that often I have to say I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure why so few men go to the doctors. I don't know why therapy seems to be less effective on men. I don't know why in an Australian study they found the biggest reason for men dropping out of therapy was they didn't have a connection with a therapist. I think about 50% of men who dropped out said that. And then the next biggest cause was therapy didn't work. So I don't know why therapy doesn't seem to be working, or why so many men are saying that. But the first step I do know is asking them to do a massive survey into what do you want from healthcare? Why are you so reluctant to go to your GP? A lot of people are saying it's around working hours, and GPs are not open outside of working hours. And because so many men are working full-time jobs more often than women, that's one of the reasons. And there's some data that says men who are retired and are no longer working at all, they are just as likely to go to GP as a woman who's retired. But these are all speculations. We're just speculating here because we don't really know. We don't have the data because no one's asking. That's why we need a Minister for Men. That's why we have a men's health strategy in the UK to put down the bedrock of information to understand what these problems are based on, and ultimately how can we solve them. That's why it's important. And that's why it's important to have a separate strategy, a separate individual just talking about men and boys issues, because they're not the same as women and girls. And we're talking about like a violence against men and boys strategy in the UK, which is not going to happen. It's going to fail, but we're talking about it. And that will be in parallel to violence against women strategy. So we'll look into how does domestic abuse impact women and men in separate ways, and how do we help men and women in separate ways, because they're not the same. These are issues that, the same issue impacting them in different ways. But without those funded positions, we don't really know beyond speculating by people like myself who are frankly unqualified to have such a conversation. But there are many ways in which therapy, in terms of what you talked about, I think if 80% of therapists are women, which is true, it's not hard to come to the understanding that maybe therapy is more designed for women. Like, think about a man going to therapy. He wants to often speak to another guy. I think there's something about guys talking to the guys, as a male therapist to a male patient, that is important, just as it is for women, because there's something unique about how a man can understand another man, for a lot of men, not all men. And that's why we need more male therapists, and we need more male-friendly therapy models. Or maybe clinical therapy isn't right for men at all. Men seem to be gravitating more towards group therapy, men's groups, what's called shoulder-to-shoulder time. So what you described as face-to-face time, which is emblematic of traditional therapy, where you're going down, sitting in a clinical environment, speaking to often a woman. Men don't often want that. They want what's called shoulder-to-shoulder time, where they're in a men's group with other men, often in some sort of physical activity, in that walking or whatever. And there's like a flat hierarchy of men where they're learning and role modeling from one another. And there's no pressure to talk. It's not a clinical environment. It's in a recognizable space, like a local pub or park or restaurant. And those are so effective. So effective. They're popping up everywhere. It's amazing how many grassroots community support groups are appearing, in the UK at least, for men. Like, I can't not talk about Men's Sheds, which is an amazing charity that came from Australia, where it's different workshops all over Australia, the UK, Canada, America, and probably other countries now, where it's basically a workshop, a shed for men, and men from all over the community, especially older, lonely men, come together and they make things. They make things and they fix things for local children often. And it's so beautiful, such a beautiful solution to male loneliness, and to give men a sense of purpose that they might be lacking otherwise. Not to mention you're mending things for free for local families, and you're alleviating the health service from these men who might otherwise be prescribed some sort of antidepressant. It's just like win, 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 win. So those are the sort of forward-thinking, progressive models that I think will help men most. But often these men's groups are shouted down. They're seen as the problem, not the solution, which is not true. They're vilified and invoke a lot of hostility, especially online. But I don't think that's fair. I think that's really That's really harsh. That's really horrible. I've seen it myself. And when people deprive men of these groups and these spaces, men's groups, you're putting them in a position of serious risk to their own life. So yeah, there's a lot to be said, but a lot of it's speculation, because ultimately we don't know. So if I was the Minister for Men in the UK, I'd be like, right, day one, survey. Let's do a massive survey. Thousands of men. I want to hear your voice. Because sadly, too often we talk about men and never to men. Too often we talk about boys and never to boys. So it's about time we talk to boys. It's about time we talk to men and ask them, like, what do you need? So stop telling boys what they need and men what they need, and start, well, what is it you want? How can we help you? And then whatever they say, from that we can learn. We can sit down and listen and learn, and hopefully make the changes that they need.
Yeah, mate, it's such a good point. There's a gentleman that I've had on this podcast a couple of years ago now. His name's Tommy Herschel, and he is probably one of the most knockabout Aussie blokes you could find. Like, if you think about the typical stereotype of an Aussie bloke, Tommy's got the accent, the look. He just really fits the mold. And he's a former school teacher who's had his own personal mental health challenges and battles in his own life, who is really in a good place now, who's going into schools and doing some amazing work. And his approach to speaking to young men in particular, and the effect that he's having on these young men, is profound. And he shared a few stories with me, and he's had, because of how powerful he knows it can be, he's had a lot of the big figures in Australian sport, be it rugby league players, cricketers, go into these schools with him and sit and shadow and watch to see the work that he does. And, the kids get a buzz out of, seeing one of those guys that they look up to and watch on the telly every week. But these kids who are, standing up in front of a class and vocalizing the trauma that they're going through at school or at home, and their mates who are jumping up and putting their hands on their shoulders and saying, I'm with you, mate, I didn't realise that this is what you were contending with at home, or I didn't realise this thing I said to you a month ago, impacted you so much because of an experience I didn't know about. And I just find it profound, because I think about how challenging that would be in any kind of school community, to get a kid to speak up in front of his peers like that. But with the right figure who understands these young kids, you can actually encourage these conversations out of them at a time in their life in which you can still mold and shift and change their lives for the better, so positively.
What a good man. That's life-saving work. Same issue. I mentioned 80% of therapists are women. We have the same underrepresentation of men in classrooms and schools. Probably about the same. About 80% of teachers are women, and that's nothing against women, but there's something uniquely important about a male teacher in terms of role modeling, especially to boys, that is sorely missing. In the UK, 25% of schools have not a single male teacher in it. So
wow, really?
Not one male teacher anywhere in the school. That's 1/4, I think, of primary schools. In America, I think it's like in kindergarten, it's like virtually no men in kindergarten, preschool at all. There are twice as many women flying military jets in the American military as a share of the occupation than there are men teaching in kindergarten. So
Wow.
that's a good way of looking at it. It's tiny. It's like single digit, maybe 2% or 3% of kindergarten teachers in America are male. So a lot of boys are being deprived of healthy male role models. Add to that the lack of fathers at home, where 1 in 4 boys don't have a father figure at home in America. So you're going from home to a school, there's no male role models. Maybe later in life you go to therapy, you're not speaking to a man. You look on TV, there's so few positive representations of men. Social media is full of manosphere grifters who we all know too well that are just exploiting that. They're not really positive. So there's a massive lack of representation, ironically, in a positive way at least, for men. And then people on the left are talking about men in a negative way, toxic this, privilege that, patriarchy, fragile masculinity, oppressive male violence. Like it seems to be an endless cacophony of carnage that is being projected onto boys' mind. I think it's something like 40% of boys in the UK have been taught about toxic masculinity. And they're like, the children, we shouldn't be telling them that. What nonsense. It reminds me of that crazy story a few years ago in Australia where a bunch of 12-year-old boys were told to stand up in assembly and apologise. For what? What are they apologising for? It's just endless negativity, it's a male deficit model projected onto men and boys in a systemic way that we can't seem to avoid. And then our politicians are too gutless to talk about it. So these conversations, I'm sure, will be offensive, but it doesn't mean they're wrong. And it's about time we opened ourselves up to the idea that there is such a thing as structural sexism against men and boys. We are doing a huge amount of harm, and we need to talk about it so we can stop. And we need to at least appoint people that are more qualified than I am to work that out. Like, I'm just trying my best. I'm not qualified to write policy for I know people that are. I work with them too, but I am qualified, I hope, by caring and being committed enough to at least fill the gap with some sort of positive words that aren't from people like Andrew Tate. And that's the best I can do, unfortunately.
Well, this is the problem, right? That when these conversations happen, people like yourself get pushed into this same category as people like Andrew Tate, who, you know, have completely different views to the views that you have. And I find in a lot of cases, the conversations that someone like Andrew Tate would have, and the very limited few things I've seen from him, actually don't seem to encourage men all that much. I feel
No.
like it encourages a very specific type of man who sees themselves as superior to others, but I don't think it encourages a genuine everyday bloke who is just trying to have healthy relationships, have a positive mental state, and move through the world in a way in which is ultimately positive for everyone.
Yeah,
This is
it's
where
sort of,
I feel so privileged, I have to say, George, because I grew up with the greatest male role model I could have ever dreamed of in my dad, who was incredibly compassionate. Every night before I went to bed, he told me he loved me. I'll be 30 in a few months, and every day I speak to my dad for an hour on the phone. And without a doubt, every time we end the conversation, he says, "I love you, mate." But he was also incredibly stoic and physically capable. And, he and my mum both worked to provide for our family. And so I feel so blessed that I had such a balanced role model at home as to what it means to be a healthy, productive man in society.
mm.
And it's why I'm so sure that we need more positive male role models online for these kids and, men our age that don't have them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what a lovely testament to your dad. And within that context, it's entirely unsurprising that you yourself seem to be such a well-adjusted man yourself. Though that isn't a coincidence. We are all the product of our experiences, good or bad. If you experience what you've experienced from your parents, it's more likely to end up as you are, which is a good man yourself. The same is true for bad men. Now, I would love to know what happened to Andrew Tate, if anything, to make him such an arsehole. But I don't think people are ready to look at him that way. Certainly not. He's not ready to look at himself that way. But that's why I guess the main priority in many ways is just more positive male role models. People always ask me that on podcasts. And the answer is the best role model is a good dad, which you already have. And that's what I want to encourage. Like more present, positive fatherhood, more respect for dads, more rights for dads, more responsibility, of course, but also more respect. And anything that comes downstream from that will surely be good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's that's maybe one of the things I've noticed on Instagram is, and I say Instagram, but because I think I spend most of my time on there from a social media perspective, but I would say it's social media as a whole, and podcasts and YouTube and wherever you consume content. In the men's space, there's a bit of a trend or a theme of like this hustle culture.
Mm.
And mate, I'm all for putting your head down and your ass up and getting after it and having a crack at life. But I'm also really, really aware of how important balance is. And I think when there is a narrative that as a man you have to be working nonstop, the sole provider, that there is no reprieve from the work, and that it is the mother's job to raise the kids and look after the kids, and your job is just to win the bread, I think you create an imbalance at home where that's not to suggest that mum can't do an amazing job by herself. There are so many great single mothers that carry the
Mm.
whole workload and their kids grow up to be amazing people. But it's important that the dad still has some time at home so that the kids have exposure to dad in their
Yeah,
waking hours.
yeah, I mean, when I talk about dad-deprived boys, I'm not trying to say they're more important than mothers. I'm just pointing out the fact that it is more often the dad that boys are deprived of. Like there are certainly a lot of single fathers, and God bless them, but there's a unique problem with fathers either being pushed or stepping out of children's lives. That is a unique problem. So I'm not trying to shame single mums, and I'm not trying to say motherhood isn't. Female role models aren't as important as male role models, but there's a unique issue with absent fatherhood that we need to discuss in a more positive way. And I'm not trying to deprive young men and boys of the value they may already get. Like you talked about hustle culture. I love a bit of hustle culture too. But I'm trying to expand that value system to find other things, to encourage other things to give men and boys value. It doesn't always have to be your job or your status. It can be your own, you being a father or you having a family of your own. It can be being a great friend or having hobbies and interests outside of work. It could be yourself. Like, there's loads of ways to find value that are not around money and work. That's not to say there aren't important things too. I'm trying to, like I said, I'm trying to give you as many colours in your palette so you can paint the richest, most vibrant portrait of life as you can. And I think in Stoicism, I think there's value to that. It's sad how people so often malign and misunderstand Stoicism as if it's like some sort of negative thing. But that's not to say it's not the solution all the time. Sometimes it's okay to be vulnerable. Sometimes it's okay to express your emotions. Both can be good. Both are good. But you should be given access to both tools and more, so you have the best chance of navigating life. And I think Stoicism can be excellent for women too. I think, dare I say it, there's something that women can learn from men in terms of emotional literacy, especially in the domain of Stoicism. And obviously there's lots of men can learn from women. There's lots we can learn from each other. And I don't think we should be depriving one of important tools. It's about adding to the conversation. It's both. It's not either or.
Yeah, this is my I guess my overall message on this topic is always that we need each other. We're in this together. We always have been. I learned so much from my mum, my wife, my sister, the women in my life.
Mm-hmm.
They're so valuable to me. So are all of the men in my life, and I think we need each other. And I don't know why. We've touched on this a couple of times, so I hate to sound like a broken record, but this kind of reductionist idea of, solving a problem for a man is creating one for a woman, or vice versa. It certainly doesn't have to be that way.
Well, it's
And I
opposite.
hope that as this conversation, and I mean this conversation from a top-down approach, like the conversation of improving men's lives, as this progresses in society and culture, I only think it's at a benefit for women too. They have men who are showing up in their lives more positively, who are able to be better supportive partners and friends and fathers. And that is ultimately the goal, that society moves forward as, a product of what is now an age and where we can connect with each other, we can share these ideas, where ultimately the work you do allows people to see themselves in those statistics, as you said, and understand that there is a whole group of people out there who have experienced something similar to them, and it's okay to speak up and seek the help.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone can find anything offensive in what we just said is a problem themselves, because the truth is we all need each other. There's so much to learn from one another. I got similarly kind things to say about my own mum, who has inspired me and acted as a role model to me my entire life, including what I've spoken about. The advice I take most from my mum is everything in moderation. And that's so true in politics. Couldn't be more true than it is now, where we need to learn from as many different places as possible, or at least expose ourselves to what they're saying, rather than being like, no, shut the door on that, you're a misogynist. Like, you might learn something from my page, but I don't think you should just follow my page. I think you should follow a wide gamut of conversations and different voices, of which I'm just one part. And we're not doing that anymore. We just seem to want to paint in the red or the blue, and not both, and certainly no colours in between. So it's apt that I give advice from my own mum, everything in moderation. I think that's excellent advice. And you're right, like, solving a problem for a man doesn't present another for a woman. Solving a problem for a man often solves a problem for a woman indirectly. Like, women benefit from having healthy, happy men who are supported themselves, because then those men are going to act more often in healthy ways themselves and treat those in their lives more positively. And those people are often women. So it's the opposite. It doesn't present a problem for women to talk about these issues. It solves many of the problems. And obviously things like domestic violence, you can't solve violence against women unless you're also willing to talk about violence by women towards men. And vice versa. Like, it's not either or, it's both, and it has to be both. because you can't solve an equation from one side. You have to look at both sides. Otherwise, nothing changes, and nothing has changed really for too long. And that's because we're not looking at both sides of the equation. And then people that do try to look at the other side of the equation, such as me, are just shouted down. So stop doing that and try to listen to what people are saying, even if your knee-jerk reaction is to reject it. And I guess if you're still listening to this podcast now, after, an hour, you're part of the solution in that way. You've made it way to the end in what is, I'm sure, a difficult conversation to hear, but you stuck around. You stuck around, so give yourself some credit.
Mate, that's a good way to finish off.
Yeah, there's always more to talk about, but yeah.
Mate, there's always more. We could sit here and talk for hours. There's a bunch of your content I've really enjoyed. I've recently only discovered your podcast in the last week or two, because I feel like you've been on so many different podcasts that I listen to, and so many shows from people I know, and ultimately discovered your podcast. And mate, I listened to and loved and was so interested in the episode you did with, was it William Costello?
Yes.
The leading incel researcher.
Yeah.
It was just so fascinating for me to hear this conversation, a lot of the misconceptions that come with that group of men. And it made me raise a question: is there a representation of women who are classified as incels?
Femcel. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is a concept that exists. I don't know how many women are in that group. I don't think it's as problematic as the male incels, but they certainly exist. There's certainly a lot of bitter women, single women who are, don't know, they take in the hostility online to try and bring down other women and other men. But I don't know enough about it. There's a massive lack of research into incels as a whole, and an even greater lack of research into femcels. But the articles I've seen talk about it. I remember reading an article by The Guardian on femcels, and they talked about them with so much compassion. They were like, these are women that have been left behind. These are women that struggle in dating, massive overrepresentation of neurodivergence. They struggle with sort of social skills. They're very highly lonely. They're very anxious. They haven't succeeded in the way they would like to, either in relationships or in like their life and their career. And they're deserving of compassion, which they are. But we don't talk about male incels in that way. We seem to think that they're some sort of terrorist threat, which they are not. And the solution to incels is not counter-terrorism, it's urgent mental health interventions, because the majority of them are not dangerous to anyone other than themselves. And they're living miserable, painful, difficult, lonely lives with very little of the world understanding them for who they are, apart from William Costello, who is fucking great. And he was so annoying when adolescence took over the world and there was a chance for us to have a real mainstream conversation about incels, who are so poorly represented in that TV program. It was utterly ridiculous portrayal of incels. It's almost the exact opposite of what an incel really is, but whatever, at least it conceptualized the concept of incels and had people talking. And I know William was banging on the door of Westminster trying to get in. Like, there's information for me to share. The public are listening. Let's have a real conversation. And they weren't interested in talking to William, despite his work being the largest work into incels anywhere in the world ever done. They were too interested in bringing in the fucking screenwriter of Netflix. Like, he's qualified to talk to Westminster about this problem. Like, you're a screenwriter, mate, and you've done a poor portrayal of incels, but you certainly made a great TV show. Congratulations. Now let's have the expert take over the microphone and let him talk like William Costello, whose work I would definitely recommend people read. And I cover a lot of his posts myself. Pretty much every post I do on incels is based on his work because it's so excellent. And it's probably the only work based on actual incels. A lot of people, like I talked about, they want to talk about incels. They don't want to talk to incels. And a lot of incels don't want to talk to them as a response. But William's work is probably the only work that speaks directly to incels in the numbers that he garners. And that's because he's trusted by them. He's managed to build a relationship with large incel communities. And that's why it's the best. And that's why I base my content off his work. But no one else seems to give a shit.
I feel like getting the Netflix screenwriter of adolescence in to talk about incels is almost like getting Brad Pitt in to talk about anti-aging because he played Benjamin Button, right? Yeah. It makes no sense. But I really enjoyed that conversation, and I learned heaps about this topic because I think what I only really learned about incels a year ago when I started seeing or hearing the term pop up in a bunch of podcasts or, online conversations. And I didn't really understand it until I started to listen and learn. But I learned the most from listening to William on your show and was fascinated with how he framed the conversation, how intelligently he puts it, and also how compassionate he is for both sides of that argument. And, not only the people who are personally affected by being a part of that group, but also the people around them and how they're affected. And yeah, I guess I encourage anybody who's listening, without us having to rehash that conversation, to go and check it out and I guess open your eyes and your heart to being compassionate to how we all move forward and to make a better society for all of us to live in. Because, mate, I'm certainly aware of this movement online from a lot of young men that is a Sigma male movement, and this idea of like loneliness and, isolating yourself, being the lone wolf, and this message around like that's something to be admired, like it's admirable to be a lone wolf. And I think there's certainly a value and a benefit in being, somewhat self-reliant, like being able to count on yourself to get things done and, and knowing you've got your own back. But man, let me tell you, there's nothing better than having good people around you. And I feel like my life is a testament to that. And I know a lot of the happy, healthy people that I know would say the same thing. So this is a really important conversation to be had.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen those movements too. And there's a reason why solitary confinement is used as a method of torture in prisons and other such places. And that's because being on your own, being isolated, is painful. It's used as a torture method. We do that to prisoners of war, especially. It's not something to be chased after. It's not something to be some sort of achievement at all. It's painful and it causes huge amounts of harm. And we should be going the opposite way. We should be finding more meaningful connections, more camaraderie, more friendships. Obviously, the Tin Men for me is a massive drain on my finances. But it's been such a massive benefit in terms of introducing me to so many amazing people, such as yourself. So I'm very rich in friends and role models of my own. And yeah, I think I'm much better off for that.
Well, mate, you deserve all the credit that you somewhat get on social media.
I get loads. I get loads of credit. I get loads of nice things said about me. But yeah, thank you.
Keep disregarding all the negative things so that we can continue to move the message in the right direction.
Oh,
I appreciate
will.
you, mate.
You too, mate. Love you chatting.
Cheers.